Merry Christmas! I have a few more Christmas books for us to share. The first one is called Jingle Bells. Jingle Bells is written by Nick Butterworth. It starts with a poem. 'Tis Christmas Eve. Dear Santa Claus will bring his gifts tonight. We'll hang our stockings by the fire and wait until it's light. I wonder what he'll bring for you and what he'll bring for me. Ah, there's no use wondering. You'll have to wait and see. Christmas time. A happy time, or so it should be. Why then, on this Christmas Eve, did two small mice look so unhappy? It's that cat, grumbled Lottie to her brother Jack. He always spoils things. Ah, yes, that cat. It should have been wonderful for the mice living in a stable on a farm. There were games to play, places to explore, and usually plenty to eat. There was only one problem. That cat. The mice had been hiding food for their Christmas dinner, but the cat had discovered their hiding place. He didn't particularly like cake or cheese or apple, but still he had eaten every bit and left the mice with nothing. That cat. Cheer up, said Jack. Look what I found. It was an old glove. Jack began to chew at it. We can't eat that, said Lottie. Jack went on chewing. Soon he had gnawed off 2 of the glove's fingers. There, he said, Christmas stockings. 1 each. We can hang them up for Santa Claus. Brilliant, said Lottie. I've never had a Christmas stocking. That night, as the mice snuggled down to sleep, they wondered what Santa Claus would bring them. Lottie had written their names on a note that she put next to their Christmas stockings so Santa Claus would know who they were for. Soon, Lottie began to snore. Jack began to dream, and the air was filled with the sound of sleigh bells. Christmas morning, the day was fresh and bright as Lottie and Jack hurried excitedly to look at their Christmas stockings. They were empty. Nothing, said Jack sadly, not even a nut. Lottie picked up the note she had written the night before. Look at this, she said. Underneath their names, someone had written, Not here, gone away for Christmas. I know who wrote that, said Jack. They both knew. It's time we taught that cat a lesson, said Lottie. But what can we do, said Jack. He's so big and strong. Well, said Lottie, I think we should go and talk to Tanchi. Tanchi was a rat. Actually, his real name was Gavin, but he liked to be called Tanchi. He wore glasses that had no glass in them, and he wore clothes that he had borrowed from dolls in the farmhouse attic. He also borrowed furniture from the doll's house, which he said made his place more homey. Lottie and Jack made their way through the snow toward the barn where Tanchi lived. Suddenly, Jack spotted something. It was shiny and golden. It's a bell, said Jack. It's a sleigh bell, said Lottie. It must have fallen off Santa Claus's sleigh. It's lovely. Let's take it with us. We'll show it to Tanchi. When the mice reached the barn, they were quite out of breath, but there was still a difficult climb to make. At last, puffing and panting, they came to a little door at the top of the barn. Before Jack could knock, the door opened. Good morning, and a very Merry Christmas to you, said the rat. The mice smiled and replied nervously. Then they stepped inside. Tanchi shut the door. It's hard to say exactly what the mice and the rat said to each other, but whatever it was, when the door opened again, all 3 were smiling. Thank you very much, said Lottie and Jack together. Tanchi smiled. The pleasure is all mine, he said. Cats can be such a terrible nuisance. Later, after a Christmas dinner of some borrowed fruitcake that Tanchi had given them, the mice could be seen wrapping up a parcel. Later still, they tried not to be seen as they cautiously carried their parcel towards the farmhouse. The day after Christmas, Mrs. Mackey, the farmer's wife, swung her feet out of bed and into her slippers. At the foot of the stairs, the cat brushed past her legs. "Hello, Angus," she said. "What's this?" She picked up a small parcel that lay on the mat and read the label. "It's an extra present for you, Angus," she said to the cat. Angus watched as Mrs. Mackey opened the parcel. What could it be? "It's a little bell," said Mrs. Mackey, "on a pretty red ribbon." Before he could escape, Mrs. Mackey took a firm hold of Angus and tied the ribbon around his neck. The little bell jingled under his chin. "There," she said, "you look lovely." Angus twisted his neck uncomfortably and the bell jingled again. He made a face and pawed at the bell. "Don't you dare," said Mrs. Mackey. "Keep it on." It was late afternoon, around tea time. Lottie and Jack were having great fun in the stove. Suddenly they stopped and listened. They could hear the jingling of a little bell. "Quick, someone's coming," whispered Lottie, and the mice ran to hide in the stable. As they peered out, they saw a very cross-looking Angus go stalking past. He looked from side to side and shook his head. The little bell jingled merrily. Grunted Angus, and he stumped off, jingling as he went. The mice burst into a fit of giggles, and Lottie began to sing, jingle bells, jingle all the way. Now Angus can't sneak up on us when we go out to play." They laughed and laughed. "It may not have been a very Merry Christmas," said Jack, "but it does look like a Happy New Year." The next one is called Snowbear's Christmas Countdown. It's written by Teresa Smith. It was the month of December and time for Snowbear to get ready for Christmas. On the first day, he wrote a list of all the presents he wanted Santa to bring him. On the second day, he took his favorite wool hat and scarf out of the storage closet and checked it for moth holes. On the third day, he strung a cord of brightly colored lights along the roof. On the fourth day, he arranged his collection of snow globes on the mantle. On the fifth day, he wrote and mailed all of his Christmas cards. On the sixth day, he shoveled a path from his house because it had snowed the night before. On the seventh day, he made a snowman. On the eighth day, he made ornaments out of paper, glitter, and glue. On the ninth day, he picked out a Christmas tree and brought it home to decorate. On the 10th day, he set up his toy trains. On the 11th day, he went Christmas shopping. On the 12th day, he wrapped all his presents for his family and friends. On the 13th day, he went sledding down a gigantic hill near his home. On the 14th day, he caught a cold and had to stay in bed. On the 15th day, he watched his favorite holiday movies and snuggled under the blankets. On the 16th day, he cracked nuts with his new nutcracker, and on the 17th day, he hung a wreath on his door. On the 18th day, he bought a poinsettia plant to brighten up the kitchen. On the 19th day, he had Charlie over for lunch. On the 20th day, he ate too many candy canes and got a bellyache. On the 21st day, he went caroling with his friends. On the 22nd day, he went ice skating and counted all the stars. On the 23rd day, he hung up his stocking and read a book by the fire. On the 24th day, it was Christmas Eve, so he made a plate of cookies for Santa and his reindeer. And on the 25th day, with the help of all his friends, he had himself a very merry Christmas. Many of the things that Snowbear did are things that my family and I do as we're getting into the Christmas spirit and preparing for Christmas Day. The last one's called Harriet and George's Christmas Treat. This one's written by Nancy Carlson. It was almost Christmas. Harriet and George were going shopping when they saw Mrs. Hoositt leave the grocery store. "Hi, Mrs. Hoositt," said Harriet. "Hi, kids," said Mrs. Hoositt. "No time to talk. I'm off to do my holiday baking. Now be sure to stop over later for a Christmas treat." Mrs. Hoositt rushed away. "Oh no, Mrs. Hoositt's going home to bake," said George. "That can only mean one thing," said Harriet. "Mrs. Hoositt is making fruit cake. Remember last year when Mrs. Hoositt made us try a piece right in front of her?" said George. "Yuck, it tasted awful," said Harriet, "and I almost broke a tooth. Remember when you dropped Mrs. Hoositt's fruitcake on your foot?" "Ouch, that really hurt," said George. "But it worked great for cracking nuts," he said. "I'll never forget the time we used the fruitcake to play football," said Harriet. "It almost hit your little brother," said George. "That was a close call," said Harriet. "Wow, fruitcake can be dangerous." "There's only one thing for us to do this Christmas," said Harriet. "Avoid Mrs. Hoositt and her fruitcake," said George. On Monday, when Harriet and George saw Mrs. Hoositt shoveling, they pulled down their hats so she wouldn't recognize them. On Tuesday, when Harriet was helping her dad put up Christmas lights, Mrs. Hoositt looked out the window, so Harriet ducked behind a bush. For the rest of the week, Harriet and George hid from Mrs. Hoositt. By Friday, they were exhausted, but it was worth it to avoid Mrs. Hoositt's fruitcake. On Christmas Eve, they saw Mrs. Hoositt invite Harriet's brother Walt in for a Christmas treat. "Poor little pup," said George. "Soon he'll be eating fruitcake," said Harriet. When Walt finally came out of Mrs. Hooset's house, Harriet asked, "How was the fruitcake?" "Yummy fudge!" "Mrs. Hooset made fudge this year?" said George. Before Walt could answer, Mrs. Hooset opened the door. "Well, there you two are," she said. "Come in for a Christmas treat." "Okay," said Harriet. "Fudge," whispered George. "I made a big batch of fudge this year," said Mrs. Hooset. "Oh, boy," said Harriet. "But I could never find you two, and my fudge is all gone. But don't worry, I still have a Christmas treat for you." "Last year's fruitcake. Eat up and Merry Christmas," said Mrs. Hooset. All kinds of treats make people happy. I really like fruitcake and fudge for that matter. But different people have different tastes, and it's important to be grateful for the thought that people give to giving you something, whether it's what you wanted or what you didn't want. I hope this year you have a very Merry Christmas filled with happy memories and the love of friends and family. Merry Christmas, guys.